Hi, everybody. Welcome to Ask Me Anything this week. This is going to be a brief one. I wanted to have a couple questions to answer. Again, want to remind you that your work on Exodus 32 is due on the 28th of April. Then we still have a couple more assignments. Next weekend, we have the assignment on 5-5 due on Exodus 40, 34 to 38. And then we have the book critiques of the God who makes himself known and Exodus and Revolution. Again, make sure you're reading the instructions for the book critiques. It's one book critique that includes both texts. And the key issue is this isn't just reporting on the content, it's discussing and analyzing the book's strengths and weaknesses, particularly around the hermeneutical approach that each author uses to the text of Exodus. This is Exegesis of Exodus, where we want to learn how to discern and critique how scholars are reading different biblical texts so that we can learn to read things better. So what's gained, what's lost by Waltzer's hermeneutic, what's gained, what's lost by Blackburn's hermeneutic. Now, we've had some good conversation on Exodus 21, 1 to 11, on the issue of slavery within the book of Exodus. This is, again, it's easy to be against slavery, but I always like to take time during this part of the class to remind everyone that slavery is not just something in the distant past. It's a reality today. There still is a slave trade. Both of sex slaves in Southeast Asia, but it also occurs even in this hemisphere and in Europe, and there's still slavery in Africa. So this still is a legitimate issue that we need to ponder and think about and stand against as followers of Jesus Christ. The key thing in the slave laws in the scripture, particularly in Exodus 21, is to see that slavery is a given in the ancient world, and in that the three main causes of slavery would have been indebtedness, being on the wrong end of a war, or sometimes kidnapping. The Bible's clearly against kidnapping, and so most of the slavery we're looking at in Exodus 21 is what we might call indentured servanthood that had to do with being in debt. So as a form, we might think of bankruptcy. And then in the case of the enslavement of women, notice that they get a status elevation, that these women that are sold, presumably to be wives, they're not sold as concubines or sex slaves. They actually are giving legitimate rights so that they're not being abused in this marginalized position that they do find themselves in. Also, it's interesting stepping back and looking at the Book of the Covenant as a whole. If you look at the text of Exodus, starting at Exodus chapter 20, verse 22, again, do note that connection. It's in the video, but notice the connection. It's the same phrase that we see in Exodus 19:4. Thus you shall say to the people of Israel, you have seen for yourselves. Remember, it was, you have seen for yourselves what I did to Egypt, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now it's thus you shall say to Israel, you have seen for yourselves that I've talked to you from heaven. Then we get a list of laws. And do note, I think this is significant, that in this Book of the Covenant from 2022 through chapter 23, that the initial two laws, one is about how to build an altar. The second law is about slavery. So two critical issues. When we think about the law being love God and love neighbor, we have two immediate case studies that cut right to the rub on all that. So we have, you'll not make for yourself gods of gold. So it's against the opposite, be against idolatry, and the opposite of loving neighbor is injustice. And so it makes complete sense that the Torah subverts slave laws. Right, I did have one question that I wanted to answer for our class this week. This one came in, and it was a question about Exodus chapter 18. This is where God runs into Jethro. And the question was, the sources I reviewed were on both sides of what Jethro's knowing the Lord means. I'd be interested to get your insights on the interaction in general, and you can address the leadership aspects as well if you have time. Yeah, I'll just say a couple things about this. This is a significant passage. Remember back in Exodus 9:16 where it says, I have allowed caused you to stand so that my name might resound throughout the earth. We also saw in Exodus 15 that in the advance of God's people, that people heard, the chiefs of Edom were dismayed, trembling seas, the leaders of Moab, all the inhabitants of Canaan have melted away. So one of the things about Exodus is the word about who God is goes out. We're going to see Rahab in Joshua. When you read the book of Joshua in chapter 2, is going to recognize who the Lord is. So there's going to be this witness, and we're going to have outsiders hearing the good news. And so Jethro, again, he's Moses' father-in-law, but he represents essentially an outsider here who comes to know the Lord. And let's listen to at least a little bit of the text here. Moses tells him everything that God had done to the Egyptians. You can look at that at verses 8 and 9. And Jethro rejoices because that God had delivered them. And then Jethro says, "Blessed be the Lord." Remember, how do you bless the Lord? That's in the Psalms. Bless the Lord, O my soul. That just means you're actually, it's another way of praising God. So to blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the land of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with the people. And then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So I take this to be a confession. Now, if you go back digging around in some historical criticism in books about religion, you'll sometimes have this hypothesis that Yahweh resided out in the desert of Sinai, and frankly, that's hard to prove one way or the other. It's a hypothesis. So the question would have been, would Jethro have known Yahweh already? So if you come at it from that angle, you have to read the text this way. But if we just read the text as it sounds, and the key word is that no, because remember, we go back to Exodus 5:2. Pharaoh says, "I don't know the Lord." And then we have all the no language. You can go back and look at the notes on the hard heart. No is a recurring word through Exodus. It has to do with recognizing who God is. And so it's a relational word. So it's just not popped in my head, wow, I know something about the Lord. It's a confessional statement. And the key thing is, notice that it's greater than all the other gods. Look back at Exodus 15, again, just for a second, Exodus 15:11. Based on what God's done, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you among the holy ones, awesome in glorious deeds and doing wonders? So God's mighty acts in the Old Testament demonstrate God's incomparability. And so essentially, Jethro was making a confession, I would say a confession of faith. Now, what comes after that? We just have this interesting passage where Jethro gives some great advice about multiplying yourself as a leader. And I'm not sure if the question was wanting me to go down that pathway, but it is critical just for organizational life that we need to learn to delegate out the things so that we can focus most of our time doing the things that only we can do. I mean, that's the key to life, and that's a key to a theology of giftedness. And you can look at, Romans, 1 Corinthians, where it talks about the gifts of the Spirit and how God, or even Ephesians, where it has some similar texts. The issue ends up being the people of God work best when we're truly utilizing our gifts, what comes out of our strengths and our passion. We're also going to see this if you read carefully through the tabernacle accounts. We're going to have people using their gifts, and the Spirit's going to give gifts of craftsmanship to certain persons during the tabernacle account. So that was the only question that I had this week. But I'm available to answer any other questions that anyone has. Again, remind you that we do have, if you're interested, a Hebrew reading group on Tuesdays at noon. And I'll be back here next Friday to answer any questions that you have. Look forward to reading your work. I've been returning the work fairly quickly, so if you get papers in, I'll try to get them back and timely with some good feedback for you. Again, grateful for everybody. Make sure you turn in at least 2 of these Module 7 papers and then get the book critique. and the final paper in on time. And do note, we're winding things down. We're we're really 3 weeks from being done now. The semester's gone so quickly. Maybe I think it's 3 weeks from being done now. So it's coming upon us very fast. Anyway, I'm Brian Russell. It's a privilege to serve you. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful weekend.